fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Because Progressive offers discounts for paying in full, owning a home, and more. Plus, you can count on their great customer service to help when you need it, so your dollar goes a long way. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save on car insurance. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states or situations.
Before we get started, I wanted to announce really quickly that I'm doing another trip with my friend Josh Hallmark with True Crime Bullshit. We are going to Costa Rica in November of this year. Those who went on the South America trip last year can tell you that we made lifelong friendships, and it's just an incredible way to meet and connect with new people and have some fun experiences. I will leave a link to the trip in the show notes. There are 9 or 10 spots left, and that is before Josh is really pushing the trip. His listeners tend to fill up the spots pretty quickly, so I definitely wanted to give my listeners a chance to get in there. I do want to be really clear, though, that while this trip is for True Crime Podcast listeners, this is not a true crime tourism trip. We aren't exploring murder scenes or haunted places where terrible things happened. Nothing like that. We will talk about true crime and podcasting, of course, because that's what we all have in common. But on the South America trip, someone brought her husband, and he does not even listen to true crime, and he had a blast. It's really a chance to travel and have fun and make new friends. So go ahead and check out the itinerary and the pricing, and let me know if you have any questions. When Kara Nichols went missing, her family released relevant details of her life, even though they thought it might impede getting attention on the case. It turned out they were right. Until the right investigator got the file and soon uncovered the truth. I'm Charlie, and welcome to Crimelines. Hello and welcome to Crimelines. This week's episode covers a case that was solved because the family pushed. As inspired as I am by families like this, it is so hard to know that sometimes a case being solved is dependent on people who are already deeply grieving, and they have to compartmentalize that to focus and get results. This is a case that is solved, so the pushing eventually worked. But I do know a few families, like Jacob Blondine's brother Eric and Maura Murray's sister Julie and Alyssa Turney's sister Sarah, who have all done the right things and have all pushed and still don't have answers. So I present this case to you while acknowledging both the pain of the family and the hope their work and success gives other people with missing loved ones. Today we are talking about Kara Nichols, who was born in May of 1993. Her father, Paul, told People magazine that Cara had a magnetic personality. She was an extrovert, and people were drawn to her. In her teen years, Cara had some pretty serious struggles. It seems to have started with a shoplifting incident when she was 13, which is obviously not okay. If your teen shoplifts, there needs to be a consequence and a look at what caused it. Did they feel entitled to the item? Was it an impulse and they don't even know why they did it? Is impulsive behavior something you see in other areas of their life? The why behind it is as important as the consequence, but shoplifting is just as often a one-off incident of a child pushing boundaries as it is a sign of a deeper problem. So also, don't freak out if your kid does this, but keep an eye on it because Cara did get caught. And she experienced consequences, but this did turn out to be one act in a series of behaviors that her parents did their best to intervene on. They realized Cara was dealing with mental health issues, so they got her into therapy and on medication, but she didn't like the side effects of the medication, so she stopped taking it. And then she started using illicit substances with her friends, and that eventually led to a heroin addiction at a relatively young age. It is so hard to hear about someone who uses drugs to deal with their mental illness because it, long-term, makes things worse. And for a lot of people, the substance abuse becomes a bigger problem in their life than the mental illness ever was. With interventions and alternative schooling options, Cara did graduate high school in Colorado Springs, where she grew up, and she worked as a server at a restaurant after. Within about a year of her graduation, her family moved to Chicago, and Cara ended up attending a drug rehab program out there. After she left the program at 19, she decided to move back to Colorado Springs in 2012, and she moved in with some roommates. She most definitely would have benefited from living at home a little longer, but she wanted to be on her own. Fortunately, her brother Terry was living in the Colorado Springs area, and he was trying to look out for her the best he could. The two talked pretty much every day. Cara, hoping to turn things around post-rehab, was pursuing her dream of fashion modeling. She had a profile up on a freelance model website, a legitimate one, and she did at least one photo shoot in the short time she was back in Colorado Springs. If modeling didn't take off, or not in a way that could pay all the bills, Cara was also exploring adjacent careers, like becoming a professional makeup artist or going to cosmetology school. Cara loved art and self-expression, and working in a field adjacent to modeling seemed like a good fit. So knowing how much Cara wanted to be a model, her roommates were excited for her when she told them that she had to go up to Denver for a photo shoot. She was excited enough about it that she even called her brother on the night of October 9th, 2012, to tell him about it. And he was excited for her that the modeling thing was working out. The next day, Terry called Cara to see how everything went, and his call went straight to voicemail. That was pretty unusual for Cara to have her phone off or the battery dead, so he kept trying to reach her that day, and it was the same thing every time, straight to voicemail with no return call. So on the following day, on the 11th, Terry drove over to Cara's house to see what was going on. He talked to her roommates, who said that they had seen her on Tuesday night, the same night Terry had last spoken to her, and she had that plan to go to Denver. But when Terry looked around the house, it didn't look like Cara had taken much with her. Her phone wasn't there, but her charger was, and her laptop and her hygiene products were still in the house. Even her professional quality makeup kit was there, which she likely would have taken with her to a photo shoot. Terry reached out to their parents and let them know that he didn't know where Cara was, and neither did her roommates. Terry went to the police at one point in these early days and was essentially told she was an adult and she was allowed to be out of contact. When they didn't hear from Cara after a couple more days, her father did call the El Paso County Sheriff's Office and reported her missing. Then he and Cara's mother flew to Colorado Springs to see what was going on. When her father Paul talked to the police, he was perfectly transparent with them about Cara's time in rehab and her history of mental illness and drug use, which is not something a lot of people want to mention when they're reporting their loved one missing. They worry it means their case will be pushed to the side. After taking the initial missing persons report, a sheriff's deputy went and talked to her brother Terry, and then the sheriff put out a press release about her disappearance to the media. What they knew was that Cara was heading to Denver for a photo shoot, but she didn't have a car, so someone would have had to drive her there. There are some reports out there that say her roommate saw her get into a dark sedan, but that has not been consistently reported. In November, the police announced a tip that Cara was in touch with two women shortly before she left her home on the night of October 9th, and they thought those women may know something. They even released a photo of one of the women and asked for anyone who could identify her to come forward. The angle they were investigating at that point was that Cara, already with a history of drug use and with a dream to be a model, may have been swept up in some type of exploitation situation. They thought that someone who had knowledge of the modeling world might know who those women were who were in touch with Cara and they were maybe the people Cara was headed to for the photo shoot. And they revealed one more piece of information at that time. Cell phone records showed that Cara did travel north from her home in the direction of Denver, but they didn't say how far she made it. That information would not be made public for several years, but we know now that she didn't make it far. Her phone last pinged off a tower the night she went missing, about 30 minutes from her house, so only a third of the way to Denver. And then, it was a couple months before anything else happened in the case. In January of 2013, 3 months after Cara was last seen, her family went to the media to get some more attention and pressure on the case. The family said it was clear that drug use and/or sex work may have been part of this case. And with those revelations, they said national media interest in the case pretty much dried up. Cara was young, blonde, and attractive, so yes, the family had media interest in the beginning. But once words like escort and heroin user got thrown out there, the interest waned. At the time she went missing, we do know Cara was using heroin, according to a friend of hers. But this friend also said that she and Cara bonded over their struggles in recovery, and Cara was only using enough to ward off withdrawal symptoms. She was not known to be a heavy user at the time. And as far as involvement in sex work, that is still in question to some degree. I'm not going to say there isn't evidence of it. A friend said she drove Cara to apartments in Colorado Springs, and she believed those were to meet with clients. And Cara's photo and number appeared on Backpage, an online classified ad website that ended up getting shut down because of issues with sex trafficking. But the ad with Cara's picture on Backpage was not placed by her, according to her family. Someone else placed the ad. And while the police did find a few men who had been in touch with Cara based on that ad, none of them actually met up with her. Cara's photo also appeared on a Las Vegas-based escort website after her disappearance. And we know now in 2026 that it definitely wasn't placed by her. Who was putting up these ads is a question. The authorities certainly believed the evidence indicated Cara was likely involved in sex work to some degree, but at the end of the day, whether she did or not didn't change the fact that she was a missing person. And her family didn't necessarily want to put all of Cara's business out in the public like that. But they knew the answer to where she might be could be drug or sex trafficking related. So hiding those aspects from the public wouldn't do any good when the goal was to get the tip they needed to find Cara. So they were open about it, even though that meant interviews would get canceled and news segments would be pushed off. It wasn't long after the January 2013 media push by the family that a new detective was assigned to the case. And this is where we see the investigation really pick up some steam when they sat down and analyzed Cara's cell phone records more closely. They found that on the night she was last seen alive, October 9th, 2012, Cara was in contact with the same phone number 8 times, from about 10 p.m. until a little after 11. The communication was both over text and phone calls. In early May 2013, the investigators called the person who had that phone number, and he returned their call the next day. His name was Joel Hollendorfer. He was asked if the phone number the detective had called him on was his phone number back in early October of 2012, and he said it was. He was then told that his phone number was in communication with a woman on the night she went missing. Joel admitted he had been in contact with Cara, though he knew her by a different name, which was the name that was used in the ad. He said he had been calling multiple escorts that night, but he remembered not meeting up with Cara because she only did out calls. What that meant was that she would not have people over to her house. She only went out to them. But Joel was looking for someone who had a place he could go to, so they didn't meet up. He said he didn't know anything about Cara or her disappearance, and so he couldn't help. So then the investigators took the cell phone tower data and started mapping the route Cara went from her home to where her phone last pinged. The way they get this data from the carrier is rough, and it requires someone who knows how it works to map it out, because they send the latitude and longitude of the tower and then the degrees the phone was from the tower using azimuth degrees. So due north is 0 degrees, and then it goes around in a clockwise direction. So what the police will get will say 38.8377 104.69825 at 45 degrees. And then they have to find the tower based on the latitude and longitude, and then go 45 degrees clockwise from due north to find the approximate location of the phone. Doing this, they knew Cara left her house at 11:16 p.m. They found that she traveled primarily north until Cara was at an intersection for about 7 minutes straight, during which time 6 calls and texts pinged off of the same tower at the same angle. At 11:42, her phone changed towers, and when the investigators took this drive, it took them a minute to go from the intersection where her phone was to the new tower. Then a minute after that, her phone hit on another tower, so that indicated she was on the move again, or at least her phone was. And then the phone went offline. The new tower and placement of the phone, where it stopped pinging off a tower, put her very, very close to Joel Hollendorfer's parents' property, which was his address of record listed with the Department of Motor Vehicles. So the last place Cara's phone pinged was near the house of a man who claimed he never met up with her that night, in spite of making some effort to do so. This information was learned by the police in 2013, but the search warrant for the property was not granted until October of 2014, 2 years after Cara's disappearance. I thought I had actually written the dates from the affidavit down wrong, so I went to double check it, but I got it right. Cara was reported missing in mid-October 2012. In May of 2013, they found that Cara's phone was in contact with Joel Hollendorfer. In May, they spoke to Joel, who said he didn't know anything. Then from May of 2013 until the fall of 2014, they analyzed the cell tower data. They don't have a date in the affidavit about when they got this information and when it was analyzed, but I've covered a lot of cases, and I know it doesn't take 1.5 years to do this. It would turn out that the sheriff's department was in a state of turmoil at this time. For one thing, the initial investigator on this case didn't do a lot. The family has accused him of straight up talking them out of doing media interviews and putting up flyers, but it turned out to be worse than that. In a recorded interview, when he was being asked by his bosses about what he did in the case, he said, quote, "I apologize. It's not going to be as good as if I had, done it when all that stuff happened," end quote. So the investigator, who was on the case from October 2012 until February 2013, admitted he dropped the ball. As for the gap from mid-2013 until fall of 2014, at that time, the sheriff himself was under fire. He was supposed to finish his last term in office in mid-January 2015, but he was being accused of financial mismanagement, of having affairs with at least 3 subordinates who he then promoted and gave raises to, and for creating a toxic work environment. He denied some of the allegations and apologized for others, and in May of 2014, the Board of Commissioners gave him a vote of no confidence. This vote had no actual authority to force him to resign, so instead they asked him to resign, and he said no. The only way to force a resignation on this elected office was to do a recall vote, which was attempted in June of 2014, but they did not get enough valid signatures. The sheriff ended up resigning effective December 31st, 2014, which was 2 weeks before his term was ending anyway. He and his undersheriff were eventually indicted on federal corruption charges, but they were not convicted. Most of the charges against them were dismissed, though the former sheriff was acquitted on some. So all of that was going on at the sheriff's office during the investigation into Cara's disappearance. And how exactly it contributed to Cara's case moving so slowly, we don't know, but it's easy to see how it could have affected it. But like I said, they did finally get a search warrant in October of 2014 to search Joel's parents' property near where Cara's phone had last pinged. And this was a big search, including a group called NecroSearch International, which is a volunteer team of search specialists. They aid law enforcement in locating clandestine graves. In this case, they brought in cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar. But the first thing they did was use their own eyes to see what might be obvious, like disturbed ground. And unfortunately for this search, there were multiple areas of disturbed ground because, as Joel's mother Betty explained to the searchers, they have lived on that ranch for 30 years, and they used the field to bury animals, including old horses. So while the dogs indicated on multiple areas, they were known animal graves. But Betty did tell the investigators that they should check a property that is more or less across the street from them that Joel had access to. So the investigators got permission from the property owner to search it on October 21st and 22nd. On the first day of the search, they sat down to interview Joel to get more information. They had tried to talk to him earlier, around the time his parents' property was being searched, but he dodged them. He said it was because he was embarrassed about what he had to say and his lifestyle back in 2012. Joel admitted that he had been involved with sex workers before, and it contributed to the end of his marriage. And he also admitted to using hard drugs at that time, which I'm sure also didn't help. Joel said that he had been in touch with Cara on October 9th to meet up for sex, but in a departure from his earlier statement, he said they actually made plans. They were supposed to meet at a gas station convenience store right off the highway, about a mile from Cara's house. He went, but he said Cara never showed up. It was explained to Joel how they tracked Cara's phone's movements on the night she went missing, and the detective straight out said, "Help me understand," because the phone last pinged off a tower a minute from his home. Joel claimed he didn't know what happened. He drove out to meet up with Cara, she never showed, and he went back to his house. He suggested that maybe she followed him home from the location, like this was a setup and she planned to ambush and rob him with someone, but otherwise he had no explanation for it. He told the detective that he wanted to help and he wished he knew where Cara was, but he had nothing to offer. So, without any insights from Joel, the search of the second property was carried out, and it had an interesting result that is, to this day, unexplained. They used 4 cadaver dogs and put one at each corner of the 20-acre property, and then had them go. All 4 indicated on the exact same spot of obviously disturbed ground. They began excavating that spot, and they found that the roots underneath had all been disturbed, so someone had dug in that spot before. They went out to see how wide the area was, and it was definitely big enough for a body. But they went down farther and never found anything. It was suspected that possibly something had been buried there before and then moved, and of course at that point in the investigation, they wondered if it was Cara's body. But they didn't know, and without her body, the case stalled. The investigation didn't really pick back up for a while, even though they had a prime suspect in Joel Hollendorfer. The Nichols family was obviously not happy with the lack of movement in the case. In 2016, they spoke with True Crime Daily and said that they had gotten tips and leads directly to them that were hard to swallow. Some tips indicated Cara was still alive, like people saying they thought they saw her in various places, and often those tips were that she may be a sex trafficking victim. But then they were also getting tips that Cara had been killed, maybe by a pimp who she owed money to, or maybe she was killed by someone who had been targeting vulnerable young women, and one tip said there were more victims, upwards of 10. The family passed the tips on to the police and hoped they were being fully investigated. As new investigators came on the case and left, the family never stopped asking for tips and pushing for an investigation. We know sex workers and drug users can be targeted as victims because there is this idea that no one will care. But it's clear Cara's family cared very much, and they were going to do what they had to get answers. And it was because of the family's persistence and complaints that they got a new investigator assigned to the case in 2020. And this detective approached it as a cold case investigation, which it really was after 8 years of no signs of Cara being alive. Her social security number was never used to get a job. No one opened a bank account in her name. She never got a driver's license or state ID or applied for health insurance or government assistance. When she disappeared, all trace of her vanished. So the new investigator went over the file the way a cold case investigator would, reading through the whole thing and identifying holes or gaps in what was done. And at the top of the list of people to interview or re-interview was someone who hadn't spoken to the police before, but really should have been interviewed. That was Joel's ex-wife, Christina. She and Joel had a tumultuous marriage, and there were accusations of domestic violence against him, along with a restraining order, and then violations of that restraining order. Joel and Christina would have periods of separation and reconciliation until 2012 when they divorced. So they were not together at the time of Cara's disappearance, but they got back together in 2014 for a period of time before they again called it quits for good. Christina did not speak with the police at the time Joel was initially being investigated in 2013 and 2014. Some reports make it sound like she refused to speak, but it's also not clear how hard they tried. As we know, the investigation had some spots where they did a lot, like bringing in NecroSearch to search 2 different large properties, but then there'd be years where they did little. By the time this cold case review started, Christina had moved out of the state and stopped using her married last name, so it took some time to track her down. The FBI was enlisted to help, and they did find her at her new home in early 2022. And Christina told the agents that she was willing to talk about her ex-husband, and more importantly, something he told her in late 2014. Let me give you some timeline context to make this make sense. The authorities searched Joel's parents' property in October of 2014, and then in late November, Joel's father died suddenly of a heart attack. One night, not long after his father's death, Joel wanted to take Christina out for a ride in his truck. She went with him, and he started talking about how he felt guilt over his father's death. He thought he was responsible for it because of something he had confided in his parents. Joel then told Christina that he had, in 2012, taken an escort to a parking lot and he began strangling her during sex. He said he didn't mean to kill her, but he must have done it for too long because she stopped breathing and never regained consciousness. His framing of this to Christina was that it was an accident. Joel told Christina that he didn't know what to do, so he took the woman's body to his parents' property, and then he wrapped her in plastic and buried her in a horse grave covered with lime. According to what Christina said Joel said, he didn't confess this to his parents until after the police came out and searched their farm. We know they didn't find Cara's body, but Joel felt like the stress of the knowledge of what he did was what caused his father's heart attack. After this conversation, Christina never spoke to Joel again about what he said. For starters, she didn't want to hear anymore, but also, she didn't really believe him. His story sounds pretty specific to us because we know about his connection to Cara's disappearance, and we know about the phone records. But back then, to Christina, without having any knowledge of that, it sounded like a far-fetched story from a guy she knew was doing hard drugs at the time. She said she didn't believe the story was true until the day the FBI showed up. Not believing Joel could be an explanation for why she didn't go to the authorities. Others have speculated that maybe she was afraid of him, and it wasn't until she was asked about it years later and from several states away that she felt safe enough to speak up. Less than a week after Christina told the authorities what she knew, the police went and picked Joel Hollendorfer up on an unrelated warrant. They used it as an opportunity to talk to him again, and he again denied he ever met up with Cara. So they brought out an aerial view of his parents' property, and they asked him to show them where horses had been buried. He pointed out a few places, and some of them did align with areas the dogs had hit on back in 2014. So they asked him about an area he didn't point out that NecroSearch had marked GPR Site 3. He described it as a dry patch with a high spot and said nothing was buried there. But when the investigator showed the same map to his mother Betty and asked her to point out all the horse grave sites, she indicated GPR Site 3 as where her favorite horse was buried. Based on what Christina said, both Joel and Betty knew Cara was buried on the property, and they were giving inconsistent information about a specific spot. So the same day they talked to them, February 7th, 2022, the authorities went back to the family property to search, and they went to GPR Site 3. Which either had nothing or had a horse buried, according to Joel and his mother. They excavated the site, and 3 feet down, they found black plastic that looked like a trash bag. They kept going, and wrapped in that bag, they found a human hand. And then they found the rest of the body of a young female. In addition to the trash bags, the body had been wrapped in 3 layers of duct tape. Due to circumstances and some features, they suspected this was Kara Nichols. That was soon forensically confirmed. Joel Hollendorfer was just shy of his 37th birthday at the time Cara went missing, and 46 at the time her body was found. He was then charged with second-degree murder and tampering with physical evidence. The bond was initially set at only $50,000, but it was quickly raised to $1 million due to the seriousness of the crime, his criminal history, and the fact that he had more than a dozen failure to appear counts from older charges. He just wasn't known for showing up to court dates. And then, when the state upgraded the charge to first-degree murder, bail was revoked entirely. After Cara's body was found and Joel was arrested, Cara's family made a statement to the media, given that the renewed interest in the case also brought back up her struggles in life. They wanted Cara to be remembered for how smart and talented she was, and for people to know that what she was doing at the time of her death didn't really matter when we're talking about her being a victim. And she was obviously a victim. Though the 9+ years from Cara's death until the discovery of her body made determining the exact cause of death tricky, the medical examiner relied on other evidence, primarily the statement of Joel's ex-wife. Christina told the police that Joel said he strangled Cara and he buried her body on his parents' property in a horse grave. Well, the second part of that statement turned out to be true. It led the police directly to Cara's body. So they determined the first part was probably true as well, and the cause of death was ruled to be asphyxiation by strangulation, and the manner of death was ruled homicide, based both on Christina's statement and on the fact that Joel went to a lot of trouble to conceal Cara's death. With that said, the medical examiner did find that there was heroin in Cara's system at the time of her death, so that was listed as a possible contributing factor, and of course, that came up at trial. So let's go ahead and get into the trial, which took place in June of 2023. The state's theory of the crime was that Joel took the anger he had at his ex-wife, who he had called 15 times on the day of the murder, and he redirected it to Cara when he decided, with intent, to kill her. So where does the photo shoot in Denver and the two women the police wanted to talk to come into this? That is unclear. Maybe there was a photo shoot and Joel told Cara he would drive her to it. Maybe it was a cover that Cara gave to people to explain going out with Joel. Maybe it was entirely unrelated, but it got so much follow-up and coverage because it was the best lead they had at the beginning. That piece seemed in question, but what wasn't in question was that Cara got into Joel's car that night and drove north with him. At some point, he strangled her. The state argued if it was an accident like he told his ex, he was in a vehicle. He could have driven her to a hospital and just left her there. He could have called for help. Instead, he moved pretty swiftly to hide her body in a way that it wouldn't be found even when expert searchers were all over that field. That showed that there was some planning involved. The defense didn't argue that Joel was entirely innocent. They conceded that he was guilty of tampering by hiding her body. But however Cara died, it wasn't murder. They argued that Cara's use of heroin was reasonable doubt. Maybe she died of a drug overdose. Maybe during a consensual act of choking during consensual sex, Cara lost consciousness, and due to the heroin in her system, she could not recover from it like a sober person would. This defense made the testimony of the medical examiner pretty important for both sides. And he testified that there was heroin in Cara's system, but it's difficult to put the amount in context. He said that it was unlikely it was enough for an overdose, but without knowing Cara's tolerance, he couldn't say for sure how it affected her. The state did have that friend of Cara's testify that she knew Cara bought and used heroin, so she would have had some type of tolerance to it. But she also said she only knew her to use enough to avoid withdrawal symptoms. She wasn't out there actively trying to get high. And when I heard this, I felt very sad for Cara. She was only 19. I know so many people who found recovery in their 20s and 30s, and Cara was not given time for that. And she was also out there trying to manage withdrawals on her own when there are medication-assisted treatment options. If she was already trying to reduce harm by only using enough to avoid withdrawal, which can be life-threatening, it sounds like the next step for her would be to try something like Suboxone. She needed more time to get there, and that time was taken from her. But because Cara was a user at the time of her death, and no one knew for sure her tolerance, there is going to be a question of the level of intoxication. So on cross-examination, when the defense asked the ME about a possible overdose or if the heroin made it so she couldn't breathe again after consensual choking, he really couldn't say. Another key witness was Joel's ex, Christina, but she was barred from testifying about something the state really wanted the jury to hear. She could not talk about violence in her relationship with Joel because the judge ruled it was inadmissible, which meant she also couldn't testify that he had been convicted of harassment and protection order violations in 2012 and 2013, the same time frame Cara was killed. The state wanted this in because it showed that Joel was an angry and violent man at the time of Cara's death, but the judge found it was more prejudicial than probative. And that was such a hard pill to swallow because Cara's past, all of that was allowed in. The jury didn't get to hear that Joel was a violent drug user in 2012, but they did get to hear from the defense all about how Cara used drugs and was believed to engage in sex work. The family found this portrayal of Cara dehumanizing. Christina was allowed to testify about the confession Joel gave her, though the defense did question her on some discrepancies in her retellings. This conversation had happened several years before, so there were some things that were different in various versions, like the exact date the confession happened, and something about how he may or may not have said that he had to sell his car because there had been a dead body in the trunk. The details were fuzzy, but Christina was clear in that she was remembering the base of the confession perfectly well. And it was believable because the information she had led the police to Cara's body. Joel ended up not taking the stand in his own defense, and in closing, the defense conceded that yes, burying Cara's body and lying about it was horrible and despicable, but it didn't indicate premeditated murder. And admitting guilt to burying Cara's body didn't really matter in the end. The judge dismissed the tampering charge before jury deliberations because the statute of limitations had run out. So the jury was only deciding on the murder charge, and they deliberated for 5 hours. When they came back, they stunned everyone when they found Joel Hollendorfer guilty of manslaughter, a crime that carried just a 2 to 6 year sentence. The outrage at this was immediate. No one wanted this man back on the streets in a couple of years. But the state had one more card to play. In Colorado, if someone has 3 previous felonies, they can be considered a habitual criminal, and they would be facing a sentencing enhancement of the maximum times 4. So instead of looking at 2 to 6 years in prison, Joel would be facing 24 years if the judge found he was a habitual criminal. The hearing for that was held in July of 2023, and over 4 hours the court heard all about his other felonies, of which he had 4. None of those were the harassment or violating a protection order convictions, because those were all misdemeanors and didn't count towards this. These were theft and burglary charges from the late 90s. And the judge found that these convictions did make Joel a habitual offender, which meant he was going away for a lot longer than it initially seemed. Several people spoke at the sentencing hearing, including 2 of the investigators on the case, which is unusual in Colorado and really in any case I followed. One of them said in her statement, "Shame on you and shame on your family for hiding all your secrets." Which, fair. People wondered if there would be charges for Joel's mother for not coming forward. Some people have said outright that they don't believe Joel hid the body on his parents' property and then didn't tell them about it for 2 years. They believe Joel's parents helped cover up for their only child from the start, which is why his mother suggested to the police to search a different property back in 2014. So people waited to see if charges were coming down the line for her, but the only evidence Joel's parents knew what happened was a confession he gave to his ex, which would be hearsay in any proceeding against Joel's mother. Cara's father expressed his suspicions against Joel's family when he spoke at the sentencing, and I have to say I was impressed with how well he held it together as he made it through his statement. He had things he wanted to get out, and I know if he was overcome with emotion, he couldn't get everything on the record like he wanted, so he held it together better than I think most people could. In addition to talking about the impact of losing Cara and not knowing where she was for a decade, he wanted to cover a few things he felt were left out at trial or misconstrued. And one of those things was that he didn't believe Joel spontaneously confessed to anyone. He believed everyone in the family that Joel quote-unquote confessed to had actually helped with the cover-up. And Cara's father also went back to a tip that they had gotten while Cara was missing, that she wasn't the only victim. The tipster said there were upwards of 10 other bodies buried along a stretch of road, and he still believed that tip was accurate and that Cara was not the only victim. And this is something that got my attention because True Crime Daily looked into this, and their segment on the case was filmed and aired before Cara's body was found. They could not get in touch with the tipster, but they showed a map of the general area where the tip pointed to, and they showed it was near the Monument, Colorado area. So I took that graphic and I went over to Google Maps and I started mapping distances. The area was about 20 minutes from where Cara's body would be found. It was closer to Joel's family property than it was to Denver, which is where all the news reports said Cara was headed. Considering that the specific information about where Cara's cell phone died had not been released, I think it's interesting that the tipster pointed anywhere near Joel's property and not closer to Denver, which is what the information released had indicated. Cara's father also said that he didn't believe that Cara had been lured to meet Joel for sex, but rather to buy heroin, and he said Cara's clothing when her body was found reflected that. Cara was someone who did her makeup, her hair, and she was particular about her dress if she was going out. And she was found wearing clothes she may have gone out in, black jeans, a halter top, and a black hoodie, but she was wearing slippers. Cara's father said that is more in line with what she would wear if she was running outside quickly or down the street to meet someone to get drugs, not someone she was planning to leave with. This was just another piece of evidence in the family's eyes that the story the jury heard about an accidental strangulation just wasn't true. Cara was lured to meet up with Joel, who had planned to abduct and kill her. Just like at the trial, Joel Hollendorfer did not speak on his own behalf at the advice of his attorney. And then the judge had the final word. He acknowledged that the family was disappointed that he excluded evidence about Joel's past, which they thought led to this miscarriage of justice. But he said he was confident that, had he allowed it in, Joel would have won on an appeal on that issue. And he also acknowledged the family's grief, saying that in 25 years he had never seen so much pain, and he told Joel that he was the cause of that pain. One person caused, quote, pain, agony, and sorrow that will never cease, end quote. Because of the sentencing enhancement, Joel Hollendorfer was then given 24 years in prison. With credit for time served, he will be released no later than March of 2045 when he is 69 years old. However, his first shot at parole is much earlier than that. April of 2033, just 7 years from now, as I'm recording this, when he will be 57 years old. And Cara's family has already pledged to fight his release at every parole hearing, not just for Cara, but for every other young woman out there who will be vulnerable when a man like Joel Hollendorfer is walking the streets. It is time for March Patreon birthday shoutouts. I want to send a huge thank you to my Patreon supporters celebrating their birthdays this month. Your generosity keeps Crimelines and Beyond the Files going, and so I want to say a very happy birthday to Zoe, Ronnie, Nina, and Adrian. Thank you so much for being part of this community, and I wish you a wonderful year ahead, and from me to you, happy birthday.